Hey there! Let me tell you why I never use drainage layers or so-called false bottoms, and I don't feel comfortable telling my viewers to use them either. For the purpose of today's demonstration, I will use a clear cup and a bunch of pebbles. We're gonna talk about a pebble false layer first, and then we're gonna get to something more wicking like leca or ceramus. Most often than not, you will see people advocating for a layer of pebbles or a coarse material on the bottom of terrariums or terrarium-like setups. So let's go ahead and add a layer. Then we are supposed to place the layer of soil that we're gonna plant our plants in. Kind of like this. The idea of drainage layers or false bottoms is to prevent the roots of a plant from staying in soggy soil or in water, preventing waterlogging. And here's concern number one. Is it implied that roots will not actually grow in this layer where water will fall and accumulate? Well, we're gonna answer that a little later. Looking at my terrarium wannabe, I can clearly see there is a delimitation between my soil layer and the pebble layer. Indeed, I do have some more air pockets in the pebble layer. So now let's see what happens when we water it. Now, indeed, we can see that the water accumulated at the bottom and is now not touching the soil layer. That's a good thing, right? Well, for me, it's not. First of all, the layer of soil on top is not completely moist. And since the water is trapped at the bottom, the layer of soil will pretty much never get moist. This is not a pot. We cannot continuously run water through it because it's not gonna drain. That's easily fixable with pre-soaking the soil before putting it in our terrariums. However, the soil being wet will not last forever. It will eventually dry since it has a lot of exposure with the air, even in a terrarium. If the water trapped below doesn't really have much contact with the soil, then the soil relies on us to re-wet it. However, the fact that the water got trapped in the rocks and has no more contact with the soil cannot actually be very fixed, because that water is now, as I said, trapped. Stagnant water that has no means of evaporation will accumulate pathogens. What pathogens and how fast it will do that? It really depends on environment and on the specifics of your soil and materials used. Now, some might argue that this layer of water is not actually stagnant. It will evaporate and it will moisten the soil once again. Well, sadly, evaporation doesn't really work like that. Evaporation does happen, but it can be more efficient or more rapid or slower depending on external factors. In our case, the fact that this water has absolutely no contact with air movement, that slows down evaporation dramatically. Also, whatever water does manage to evaporate increases humidity dramatically. When humidity is higher, evaporation rates are lower, much lower. While evaporation of this water that is trapped will indeed happen, it will happen very slow. And in my experience, I would argue that it will evaporate much slower than you will have to re-wet the soil. So what will happen is the soil will become dry due to more exposure to air and also the plants absorbing the water, so you will be forced to water again, increasing the water level in your so-called drainage level. An increasing water level upon the water that has been stagnant there for, I don't know, a month, will make the water level reach the soil. And not only that, it will spread into the soil the pathogens accumulated in that month of just sitting there. And actually here we are after a few days. The top is starting to dry out, but the bottom, do we see? That water is still there. So yeah, this is exactly what I want to avoid happening. It has been 3 weeks ever since I recorded that. Everything is bone dry. But look at this. There is still a little bit of water in this false bottom. I would definitely not let the soil be so dry in a terrarium setting, so you can imagine if there's still some water now, if I would water the soil earlier than this, before it actually goes bone dry, all of this water will just accumulate here in this so-called false bottom. I don't know about other people, maybe they're okay with this, maybe this is what they want, but this is definitely not what I want. If you have some organics starting to break down in that layer, The water will be also maybe more acidic than what you started with, and it might also contain some byproducts of that breaking down, which may or may not be useful or detrimental to your plants. So in time, the process will go on forever and ever. You will top it off with water. That layer of water will increase, it will start to touch the soil will start to pick up and absorb that water and disperse it evenly, but there will always be a layer at the bottom of stagnant water which will pretty much never evaporate. In fact, the various styles of self-watering pots rely on the soil having direct contact with water. There are some self-watering pots that have cones which dip into the reservoir. There are also some self-watering pots like this one which rely on a wick, which is constantly absolutely drenched in water to have contact with the soil. Because good quality, or at least carefully chosen soil, will be very absorbent. If it has an adequate source of water on the bottom, it will make sure to wick that water all the way to the top. Self-watering pots rely on a good surface of the soil being exposed directly or at least thoroughly to water. A drainage layer limits exposure of the soil to water, making it what I call layer in terms of humidity. The reason why a pebble layer doesn't make proper contact between soil and water is because it is not wicking. It actually doesn't direct the water properly and adequately from the bottom all the way to the top. It actually aids in trapping the water on the bottom. We're going to talk about more wicking materials later. Hold on. So this is one aspect of this system that doesn't go all that well with me. The second aspect is the assumption that plants will not grow roots in the so-called drainage layer, when in fact, again, easily observable in practice, they will. The roots of many houseplants are not short. They will grow all the way to the bottom of a pot. Given the chance, they will actually grow a little bit more than the pot they are potted in. For a terrarium to have a proper drainage layer, it would have to be very, very low at the bottom. So imagine a plant like this growing its roots only, let's say, in this amount of space? No, it's not gonna stop here. It will go all the way down. So what will happen when the roots will grow down? They will inevitably grow in the so-called drainage layer, which is supposed to prevent waterlogging. Does it actually do so? Well, I would argue not, because the drainage layer is full of water. There is a constant layer of water there. So that means that the drainage layer will become just one of the layers of the soil in our terrarium. It will just not be soil, it will be something else. Now let's talk a little bit about a drainage layer that is not made out of pebbles, but something with more capillary properties, like leca, which is very popular nowadays, or ceramis, which I argue is better than leca. But hey, that's just me. Plus, ceramis is very crumbly, has a lot of dust. Ooh boy, I clogged the sink once, no thanks. So the use of leca or more wicking materials as drainage layers will solve some issues. They will solve the issue of water being trapped there. Since they will absorb that water and direct it up to the soil, your terrarium will pretty much be sort of self-watering setup in a way, except for the wick. Instead of the wick, you're gonna have ceramis or leca, which is great, much better than pebbles, I will argue. However, this does not solve all of the other problems that we have, meaning the roots inevitably starting to grow in that layer. And while I really don't believe that such a layer is as detrimental as just throwing pebbles on the bottom of your terrarium, definitely much better to use leca, I still don't see the point of it, because in the end it will just take up space, it will not serve as aeration or an aerator in any way, and I can easily achieve whatever aeration leca gives me by using a soil that has already some aerators, such as perlite or even bark. So I find it much more convenient, appropriate, and safe for roots to have a completely airy mixture throughout. Because at the bottom, yes, water will pool, but just for a little while, because it will be dispersed very evenly throughout. Just like in the case of the self-watering pot, soil will absorb and it will spread that water wherever it is. I don't want stagnant water accumulating pathogens trapped in a layer of pebbles. And I also don't want a layer of pebbles doing the exact same thing that an aerated soil does. I want everything to be evenly moist and aerated. Now, a compromise between the two worlds, I think, is a self-watering terrarium. Yep, you heard me right. This is what the biorb does. Even though I have my feelings regarding the biorb, the system of having a wall practically between the plants and their roots and the reservoir and having the water here being wicked by this material, I think this is the ideal setup for a terrarium. In this setup, the roots getting into the reservoir, the chances of that is minimal. I actually didn't have my roots going down in there. There is also a way to empty that reservoir if you so desire. There is a way to communicate with the air and to run pretty much water through the setup because it drains from there. From this point of view, this terrarium gets it right. From many other points of view, it doesn't, but this, it got it right. So in a nutshell, that's why I don't like to use drainage layers. Are there setups which actually work together with the drainage layer and it makes sense to have one? I'm sure there is. I don't have all the types of terrariums in the world, but for the ones that I did make up until now and the ones that I made available on YouTube, drainage layers are just unnecessary, bordering on detrimental. So I don't feel very comfortable advocating for them on my channel, telling people to put them. If I don't put them, why should I tell you to add the layers? However, in the end, it really is your choice and how you feel about it. If you really want a drainage layer, you're absolutely free to do so. And if I really don't want to add a drainage layer, I'm absolutely free to do so as well. So I guess that's it. Thanks. Bye.